Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the channel. Today's story is one that sent shockwaves across the world, not just because of what happened, but because of how fast and how decisively the response came. When civilians were hit once again, when homes, streets, and ordinary lives were torn apart, Ukraine did not wait. There was no hesitation, no delay, no empty warnings. The revenge was instant, calculated, and so effective that it stunned observers, analysts, and even seasoned military experts. This is the full story of how one brutal attack on civilians triggered a response that shocked the world and reshaped the battlefield. The day began like many others in a country living under constant threat. Civilians were going about their lives, trying to hold on to some sense of normalcy despite the war. Markets opened, children prepared for school. Families gathered inside homes that had already survived months of bombardment. Then, without warning, the strikes came. Missiles and drones slammed into civilian areas, ripping through residential neighborhoods with terrifying force. Buildings collapsed, cars were engulfed in flames, and the sound of explosions echoed through the streets. These were not isolated incidents or accidental damage near military targets. The strikes hit deep into civilian zones, far from the front lines. Emergency services rushed in, pulling survivors from rubble, treating the wounded and recovering the dead. Hospitals were overwhelmed within minutes. Images of injured civilians, crying families, and destroyed homes spread rapidly across social media, igniting outrage and grief around the world. For Ukrainians, this was not just another tragic chapter in the war. It was a deliberate act meant to spread fear, to break morale, and to send a message of intimidation. But instead of achieving its goal, the attack triggered something very different. It triggered an immediate, coordinated response that had clearly been prepared for exactly this kind of moment. Within minutes of the civilian strikes, Ukrainian military command moved into action. This was not a rushed or emotional reaction. It was a response built on months of planning, intelligence gathering, and battlefield experience. Ukraine had learned that speed mattered, that hesitation invited further attacks, and so the decision was made to strike back immediately, but with precision and purpose. Intelligence units went to work analyzing data in real time. Satellite feeds, drone surveillance, radar tracking, and intercepted communications were all processed at lightning speed. Launch points were identified, supply chains mapped, and command nodes pinpointed. Ukraine did not guess. It knew exactly where the attacks had come from and who was responsible. What followed was a series of strikes so fast and so accurate that they caught Russian forces completely off guard. Military facilities that had just been used to launch attacks on civilians suddenly became targets themselves. Ammunition depots erupted in massive explosions, lighting up the night sky. Fuel storage sites burned uncontrollably, sending thick columns of smoke into the air. Command centers went silent as communications were disrupted or destroyed. The timing of the retaliation was one of its most shocking elements. There was no long buildup, no visible movement that could have warned the other side. Ukrainian forces struck while Russian units were still operating under the assumption that they were safe behind the lines. This sudden shift from attacker to target created chaos and confusion across multiple sectors. Drones played a central role in this operation. Ukraine deployed advanced unmanned systems capable of flying low, avoiding radar, and striking with pinpoint accuracy. These drones were not only weapons, but also reconnaissance tools, transmitting live footage back to command centers. Each strike was confirmed, assessed, and followed up if necessary. There was no wasted effort, no symbolic gesture. Every hit had a purpose. As explosions rocked military facilities, the psychological impact began to unfold. Russian soldiers who had believed themselves to be out of reach suddenly realized that nowhere was truly safe. Reports emerged of units scrambling to relocate, abandoning positions, and struggling to re-establish communication with higher command. The sense of control and superiority that Russian leadership often projected was replaced by uncertainty and fear. Military analysts around the world took notice. What stood out was not just the damage inflicted, but the discipline behind it. Ukraine did not target civilians in return. It did not mirror the brutality it had just endured. Instead, it focused exclusively on military targets directly connected to the attack. This distinction mattered deeply on the international stage. Global leaders quickly condemned the civilian strikes and acknowledged Ukraine's right to defend itself. The contrast between the two actions was stark and undeniable. One side attacked civilians, the other responded by dismantling military capabilities. This reinforced Ukraine's position as a country fighting defensively, even when delivering devastating blows. Inside Ukraine, the response had a powerful effect on morale. The civilian attack had been meant to terrify and demoralize the population. Instead, it strengthened unity and resolve. People saw that their suffering was not ignored, that their military was capable, responsive, and determined to protect them. The message was clear. Civilians would not be abandoned, and attacks on them would carry consequences. The retaliation did not stop with a single wave. Over the following hours and days, Ukraine launched additional precision strikes, each one compounding the damage. Supply routes were cut, rail lines disrupted, and logistics hubs destroyed. Russian artillery units began reporting ammunition shortages. Fuel deliveries were delayed or halted entirely. In modern warfare, logistics are everything, and Ukraine targeted them relentlessly. Electronic warfare also played a crucial role. Ukrainian forces jammed communications, intercepted signals, and disrupted command networks. Orders were delayed or never arrived. Units became isolated, unable to coordinate effectively. This invisible battlefield, fought through signals and data, proved just as destructive as bombs and missiles. The speed of Ukraine's response suggested something important. This was not improvised, it was rehearsed. Ukraine had anticipated such an attack and prepared multiple response scenarios in advance. When the moment came, those plans were activated immediately. This level of preparedness reflected how much the Ukrainian military had evolved since the early days of the war. For Russia, the consequences extended beyond physical losses. The strikes exposed vulnerabilities that could no longer be denied. Facilities once considered secure were shown to be reachable. Air defenses failed to intercept incoming drones. Command structures proved fragile under pressure. These revelations forced Russian leadership to divert resources toward protecting rear areas, weakening their ability to conduct offensive operations. Reports from the front lines suggested a noticeable drop in morale among Russian troops. Soldiers spoke of exhaustion, fear, and frustration. Many questioned why civilian attacks were being carried out if the retaliation was so costly. Some units reportedly hesitated to carry out orders, aware that any action could trigger another devastating response. International media coverage amplified the impact of the events. Headlines around the world focused on the speed and effectiveness of Ukraine's retaliation. Analysts described it as a textbook example of modern defensive warfare. Rapid intelligence processing, precision strikes, and strict adherence to targeting military assets only. The phrase instant revenge became widely used, not because of emotional language, but because of the sheer speed of the response. At the same time, Ukraine continued to strengthen its defenses. Air defense systems were repositioned, shelters reinforced, and emergency protocols updated. The country made it clear that retaliation did not replace protection. Both were necessary, and both would continue. One of the most remarkable aspects of this episode was Ukraine's ability to control escalation. The strikes were powerful enough to hurt, but measured enough to avoid spiraling into uncontrolled confrontation. This balance required discipline and confidence, qualities that Ukraine demonstrated under immense pressure. The civilian attack and the instant revenge that followed became a defining moment in the conflict. It showed that Ukraine was no longer simply reacting to events, but shaping them. It demonstrated that cruelty would not go unanswered, and that intelligence and strategy could outmatch brute force. For many Ukrainians, this moment became symbolic. It represented a turning point where fear gave way to determination, where loss was met with action, and where justice, in the form of lawful military response, was delivered swiftly. As the war continues, the lessons from this event will echo far beyond a single day. They will influence planning, deterrence, and decision-making on all sides. Russia will have to consider the cost of every strike. Ukraine will continue to refine its ability to respond faster and smarter than before. This was not just a revenge story. It was a message to the world. A message that attacks on civilians are not only morally wrong, but strategically disastrous. A message that modern warfare rewards precision, preparation, and restraint. And a message that Ukraine is ready to defend its people, instantly and brilliantly. The world watched as events unfolded, and many realized that this conflict is no longer defined by who strikes first, but by who responds best. On that day when civilians were hit, Ukraine's response shocked the world, not just because of its power, but because of what it stood for. As we continue to follow this war, moments like this remind us why the story matters, why the details matter, and why understanding the strategy behind the headlines is so important. Thank you for watching. Stay informed, stay safe, and I'll see you in the next video.